Good morning. Thank you for coming to this final lecture in the Edward Said lecture series. We started the lecture series on September 25 on the anniversary of Said's untimely death in 2003. And we're ending it, actually, this is the week, November 1st was his birthday, and he would have been 80 years old had he been here. So it's auspicious that we're having our last lecture on the anniversary of his birthday. We started with David Lloyd on the responsibility of the public intellectuals. And today, for the closing lecture, we felt it was appropriate to have a panel of activist public intellectuals addressing issues that we're struggling with today in the academy and beyond. A panel titled Universities at the Crossroad, the Assault on Academic Freedom, something that has increasingly escalated in the last decade. This is an appropriate closing panel because Said remained an activist public intellectual to the very end in his writings and actions, particularly on the question of Palestine and other current issues of oppression and justice. Now, to introduce our distinguished panelists who have come from quite a distance, Professor Richard Falk needs no introduction. He is the Albert G. Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice at Princeton University, where he taught for 40 years, and currently directs Global Climate Change, Human Security and Democracy, a research project of the Orfalea Center at UC Santa Barbara. In 2008, he was appointed to a 6-year term as UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights in occupied territories, a role that gained him international recognition as well as numerous attacks for his unabashed support and advocacy for Palestinian human rights. He is the author of over 50 books and numerous articles. He has enriched our world with his scholarship, guided us and many established scholars in the field with his teaching and mentorship, and more importantly, he has inspired us with his steadfast struggle for peace and justice, peace with justice. Quoting him from his description of the activist role of a citizen pilgrim, he states, "My overriding concern is to foster an abolitionist movement against war and aggression as social institutions, which implies the gradual construction of a new world order that assures basic human needs of all people, that safeguards the environment, that protects the fundamental human rights of all individuals and groups without encroaching upon the precarious resources of cultural diversity, and that works toward the nonviolent resolution of intersocietal conflicts." Thank you, Richard. We're honored by your presence today. Our second panelist, to my left, is also someone who's an inspiration to me because she represents the new generation of activist public intellectuals. Azadeh Shahshahani is former president of the National Lawyers Guild. She just stepped down at their annual meeting from the 3-year term. National Lawyers Guild is an organization that has been extensively involved in issues of social justice, attacks on civil rights, First Amendment rights, and academic freedom. In her work in North Carolina and Georgia, Azadeh has been extensively involved in defending the human rights of immigrants and Muslims, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. Through the National Lawyers Guild, Azadeh has participated in many international delegations, including a 2014 delegation focused on the situation of Palestinian political prisoners, as well as people's tribunals focused on Mexico and the Philippines. She's the author and editor of several human rights reports, including a 2012 report titled Prisons of Profit, Immigrants and Detention in Georgia. Azadeh received her JD from the University of Michigan Law School and has a master's degree in modern Middle Eastern Studies and North African Studies from the University of Michigan. She's the recipient of a number of awards, including the American Immigration Lawyers Association 2012 Advocacy Award. We'll begin with Azadeh's presentation titled Censoring Palestine at the University, Growing Threats to Academic Freedom. And then we'll follow with Dr. Falk's titled On Edward Said's Humanism and the Rejection of the State Department's Definition of Anti-Semitism. But before we start, let me thank our community partners and co-sponsors. They're all listed on the flyer that you have. I also want to thank the California Scholars for Academic Freedom and the National Endowment for the Humanities, without whose support this series of talks would not have been possible. Please help me welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much. I wanted to also thank Fresno State and the Linguistics Department, and especially Professor Samiian for the invitation for us to be here today. And I'm honored to share this panel with Professor Samiian and with Professor Richard Falk. So in response to the rising movement for Palestinian rights with groups such as the Students for Justice in Palestine and calls for boycott, divestment, and sanction campaigns, there's a growing rise in attempts to silence advocates for change, using a variety of tactics, pro-Israel advocacy groups, pressure government actors, universities, and private institutions to investigate, censor, and punish individuals and groups who criticize Israel or who support Palestinian rights. On college campuses, students and professors have faced intimidation or organizational shutdown, and local, state, and national government actors have introduced legislation targeting BDS campaigns. And again, everyone knows BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is a movement that started in 2005, and it was initiated by a number of Palestinian organizations. And so, the movement here is in solidarity with the Palestinian call to pressure Israel to abide by international law and end the occupation, and hopefully come up with a solution for the Palestinian refugees to be able to go home. And so organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild, Palestine Legal, and many more work towards confronting the suppression of Palestinian advocacy through providing legal support. Understanding the tactics and solutions needed to combat the targeting of Palestinian solidarity activism requires knowing the common issues faced on college campuses. So some of the issues faced by students and professors, basically that, again, is aimed to silence Palestine solidarity advocacy is complaints and lawsuits. So these have been largely unsuccessful, but they do exact a significant emotional and financial toll. Punishment. So universities frequently punish students and faculty for a speech that is critical of Israel. Some examples, and I'll talk more about all of this later, but this is just a summary. So students criminally prosecuted for peaceful walkouts, groups suspended for distributing human rights flyers, and a tenured professor fired for his tweets on Gaza, which is Professor Steven Salaita. Censorship. So institutions respond to pressure from Israel advocacy groups by canceling or altering academic and cultural programs. So some examples: the University of California, Hastings Law School withdrew its support of a conference titled Litigating Palestine after intensive complaints from Israel advocacy groups. Legislation. So attempts to redefine anti-Semitism to include common criticism of Israeli policies and advocacy such as BDS. Some examples resulted in a non-binding legislation in the California legislature condemning such activism and resolutions in the student government bodies and similar initiatives. And then after the American Studies Association's academic boycott resolution in 2013, legislation was introduced in several states threatening to defund public universities which paid for ASA memberships and other expenses. False accusations of anti-Semitism, so frequent conflation of criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism, harmful distortion of and distraction from real anti-Semitism and human rights violations faced by Palestinians. False terrorism charges. So activists falsely accused of supporting terrorism, which can have severe consequences, such as bringing undue law enforcement scrutiny upon individuals and groups. Some examples: SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, is a student group with many chapters on college campuses, and it has been accused of having ties to Hamas, despite lack of evidence of any such ties. Civility. So many universities resort to labeling critique of Israeli policies as uncivil or divisive, echoing the arguments of the Israeli advocacy groups that exert pressure on them. Official condemnation of certain viewpoints has a chilling effect on campus community members who hold those views. So some examples: University of California President Mark Vida consistently lumped student protests of Israeli policies with racist incidents on campus, including nooses hung on dorms, swastika, vandalism, and attacks on LGBTQ students. Bureaucratic perils, so universities resort to various measures that hinder student organizing for Palestinian rights. So students face difficulty reserving rooms, difficulty getting events approved. They're required to pay for or accept extensive security measures at their events, and they're called in to discuss details of their events with administrators. These types of measures force the student groups to defend their activities rather than spending their energy for organizing for Palestine. And obviously, these types of repressive measures affect both the students and faculty rights, and at the core, the free speech rights, which, as we all know, is the cornerstone of the democratic system in this country and our Constitution. So some specific examples that I wanted to talk about. The case of Professor Steven Salaita in 2004. He was fired by the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign after he made posts on his social media accounts accusing Israel of human rights abuses, and he was sending out these tweets during the Israeli attack on Gaza. So a group of law professors wrote that his termination, quote, on account of his opinions on the Middle East affects not only him individually, but all current and prospective faculty at the University of Illinois, as it will have the predictable and inevitable effect of chilling speech, both inside and outside of the classroom by other academics, which is definitely a true judgment. So Salaita, represented by the Center for Constitutional Rights and the law firm Levy & Levy, filed a civil lawsuit against the university in January 2015, alleging violations of his constitutional rights and breach of contract. In August of 2015, a federal judge denied the university's motion to dismiss the lawsuit, finding that Salaita's tweets, quote, implicate every central concern of the First Amendment. So the lawsuit is going forward, and Professor Salaita is right now at the American University in Beirut for a one-year term, and the demand is basically for the University of Illinois to reinstate him, which, you know, we hope with all the pressure coming from various corners, including academia, that they will in fact do that. And at Northeastern, we had an issue with the SJP chapter being suspended. So, you know, some organizations, such as Hillel, Zionist Organization of America, and the Anti-Defamation League, have accused groups such as SJP of harassment at best and anti-Semitism at worst. And so, you know, these types of accusations affected the SJP chapter at Northeastern as well. And there's also pressure from donors. So Robert Shillman gave millions of dollars to Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and he also sat on the board of trustees of that institution, and he wrote in public support of Zionist Organization of America, which wrote a letter to Northeastern president in July 2013, expressing concern about SJP and anti-Semitism. And then in 2012, we had a Boston-based group, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, which released a series of videos characterizing Northeastern University as having, quote, a general anti-Semitic climate and as a heaven for Islamic extremism. So, again, Northeastern SJP was suspended and could no longer meet as a student group on Northeastern property or receive university funds. The administration cited several violations of campus policies and procedures, resulting in SJP failing to get university approval to distribute 600 flyers. The flyers were designed as mock eviction notices. They warned the reader that their dorm was scheduled for demolition in 3 days, followed by statistics on displaced Palestinian families, and had a disclaimer at the bottom which says this is not a real eviction notice, hashtag Boston mock eviction. And so there was a requirement to obtain pre-approval before distributing flyers in a student, before distributing flyers, and this requirement was noted in the Student Resource Handbook at Northeastern, but the university did not consistently enforce the policy, which again points to the double standard that is at play when it comes to students doing Palestine advocacy and groups. You see some, you know, obscure policies that are never enforced against other groups all of a sudden being highlighted and enforced by the administration of the universities, again, partly as a result of pressure coming from outside groups. And 2 female undergraduate students were also sanctioned for endangering fellow students, for so-called endangering fellow students when they allowed the eviction notice distributors into their dorms. I should mention that there was a petition targeting the university president demanding that the SJP be reinstated, and the petition had collected upwards of 6,000 signatures. In terms of legislation, at the national level, we had the Academic Freedom Act, which was introduced by Congressman Ruskin, who's the chief deputy whip and co-chair of the House Republican Israel Caucus, and a congressman from Illinois, Dan Lipinski, and they introduced the Protect Academic Freedom Act, which basically would deny federal funding to colleges and universities that participate in the boycott of Israeli academic institutions or scholars. The bill was drafted in response to the American Studies Association's resolution in 2013 to boycott Israeli academic institutions. And the National Lawyers Guild, Center for Constitutional Rights, and CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, urged lawmakers to recognize that denying federal aid based on such protected speech violates the First Amendment and threatens academic freedom. Then you've had legislation on the state level as well. In several states, bills have been introduced or resolutions, and in some states they have in fact passed. So in Tennessee was the first state to officially condemn the BDS movement. The bill declared the BDS movement as, quote, one of the main vehicles for spreading anti-Semitism and advocating the elimination of the Jewish state. The bill passed in the Senate on April 9th on a 30-0 vote, and the House passed it 93-1 on April 21st. The resolution states that the BDS movement and its agenda are, quote, inherently antithetical and deeply damaging to the causes of peace, justice, equality, democracy, and human rights for all of the people in the Middle East. In California, as I'm sure you all are familiar, there was unanimous support and approval for a measure urging the University of California to condemn all forms of anti-Semitism. But the language of the resolution was very interesting. So portions of House Resolution 35 said, and I'm quoting, whereas the United States Commission on Civil Rights reported in 2006 that anti-Semitism exists on some college campuses and is often cloaked as criticism of Israel, and recommended that colleges and universities ensure that the students are protected from actions that could create a hostile anti-Semitic environment, and whereas the Assembly commends the initial actions taken by the University of California to address anti-Semitism on its campuses, such as 1, refusal by the UC Board of Regents and the President of the UC to consider divestiture from companies doing business with Israel. And it goes on, and so, you know, this was the legislation, and the response from Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an organization that has been very important and at the forefront of solidarity with Palestine. Carol Sanders, a member, was quoted as, this bill challenges the real definition of anti-Semitism by conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism itself. And there was legislation introduced, as I said, in several other states, including Indiana, Maryland, New York, and Illinois. And then you have blacklisting. So in the state I come from, Georgia, the Jewish organization Hillels of Georgia, by its own account, quote, compiled a list of all the Georgian professors or graduate students that voted in favor of the boycott. This is the American Studies Association boycott measure again. Listed where they work and encouraged our student body to choose wisely when they register for classes. I should mention several of my own friends who are academics actually ended up on this blacklist. Another incident, a banner reading "Stand for Justice, Stand for Palestine" was taken down at Barnard College following complaints by pro-Israel advocacy groups. And another case, which I'm going to talk about more later, the Florida Atlantic University, at Florida Atlantic University, 5 students were put on indefinite probation and ordered to take a civility training course after briefly protesting and walking out of a talk by a member of IDF, the Israeli Defense Organization. And so I wanted to talk about some instances where the National Lawyers Guild has been lending support to the Palestine advocacy movement. And so, you know, I should mention we are joined in this fight by several other groups, which is now Palestine Legal, an organization that is devoted to documenting instances of suppression of speech of students and academics on college campuses and lending them legal support. So jointly with CCR, we helped launch Palestine Legal, which was and is a resource meant to ensure that Palestine solidarity activists have the legal support that they need to exercise their First Amendment rights and to continue organizing. So basically our purpose was to build a national support infrastructure for the Palestine Solidarity student movement, student and faculty movement. And the coalition has also responded to Title VI investigations. This is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. As Zionist groups have begun to aggressively warp Title VI, which prohibits discrimination in federally funded educational institutions, into a tool for suppressing students' free speech rights on Palestine in particular. And so the coalition lent support to student groups at Rutgers, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Berkeley by securing representation for students and faculty who were under attack. And so we also called on universities to protect open debate on Palestine and Israel. So after the American Studies Association passed the boycott resolution in 2013, there was a backlash. And there was a series of repressive responses, and so the faculty, many times the faculty who supported this resolution were junior faculty, and so they faced implicit threats sometimes by senior faculty, by the administration, threats of cutting of their funding, and so the letter was meant to remind the faculty, the senior faculty and the university presidents in particular about the importance of free speech, especially in an academic environment. And so we said in our letter that the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly reaffirmed, quote, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. And as I mentioned before, we have been very active on the matter of both Title VI complaints, and then Department of Education, Civil Rights Division was contacted by pro-Israel advocacy groups to basically investigate pro-Palestine activism. And so they actually closed their investigations that falsely alleged that Palestinian rights activism created an anti-Semitic climate. The complaints underlining the investigation claimed that the student protest and academic programming in support of Palestinian rights and critical of Israel, quote, created a hostile environment for Jewish students. And so we were very active in writing letters to the Department of Education, Civil Rights Division, pointing out that this is in fact not the case. And again, it comes to free speech. And so just a quote from one of our members, Matt Ross, who said that we are pleased these baseless complaints have been dismissed, though puzzled by the amount of time it took to reach this result. The National Lawyers Guild will continue to defend the free speech rights of the students to engage in sharp criticism of Israel. And so several organizations, in addition to the NLG, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Asian Law Caucus, and CARE, whose activism, they advocated for students whose activism was scrutinized in the investigations and have worked to challenge the misuse of civil rights laws to intimidate the students and dissuade them from advocating for Palestinian rights on campus. And so I wanted to make sure to get to a couple of recent reports that have been issued by Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as another report. So Jewish Voice for Peace, again, is a national grassroots organization and is inspired by the Jewish tradition to work for a just and lasting peace according to principles of human rights, equality, and international law for all the peoples of Israel and Palestine. And so they released a report recently, I think about a couple months ago. It was titled The Stifling Dissent, How Israel's Defenders Use False Charges of Anti-Semitism to Limit the Debate over Israel on Campus. And so the report recommends that campus administrators strive to create an open campus climate that is inclusive of all student perspectives by avoiding policies that conflate the state of Israel with Judaism or the Jewish people. And another report that I hope everyone gets a chance to check out that was released by Palestine Legal and Center for Constitutional Rights. It is titled The Palestine Exception to Free Speech, a Movement Under Attack in the U.S. And so, some statistics that it cites, Palestine Legal responded to nearly 300 incidents of suppression. Obviously, there are many, many more instances of suppression, but these are the ones that they documented. 85% of those incidents targeted the students and professors on a total of more than 65 US college campuses. And in 2014, there were 152 incidents of censorship, punishment, or other burdening of advocacy for Palestinian rights. 68 requests for legal assistance in anticipation of such actions, the vast majority, 89% in 2014, 80% in 2015, involving colleges, students, university professors, or academic institutions, academic associations. And then in 2015, from January 1st to April 30th, Palestine Legal documented 60 incidents involving accusations of anti-Semitism made against the students or faculty based solely on a speech critical of Israeli policy, 24 incidents involving accusations of support for terrorism made against the students or faculty based solely on a speech critical of Israeli policy. And so, the report is very comprehensive. It lists all the various suppressive tactics that are used by pro-Israel groups and in turn the university administrations. And it has a very comprehensive list of recommendations targeting the college and university administrators, the US Congress and state and city legislatures, the US Department of State, the US Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, law enforcement, student professors and activists, and then the general public. But what they do emphasize, obviously, is they would like the students, faculty, activists, the general public to make sure to first read the report and second to be aware of their rights, to advocate freely for Palestine, to be in solidarity with Palestine, and not be afraid of the threats posed by Zionist, pro-Israel organizations, and to use Palestine Legal, National Lawyers Guild, Center for Constitutional Rights, and all these other groups that are here to provide support to Palestine solidarity activists. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure and challenge to participate in this program honoring the memory of Edward Said and devoted to the protection of freedom of expression with respect to the Palestinian struggle. I'm particularly thankful to Vida Samiian, who has organized over the last few years this extraordinary effort to swim against this current of suppression. And it should be a source of pride to the Fresno community and the university that this kind of effort at exposing the dangers to academic freedom have been taking place, and they need to happen many places in this country in order to counter the sort of insidious developments that Azadeh spoke so convincingly about. And I would also take the opportunity to say that the National Lawyers Guild has been one of the courageous organizations for many years standing on the forefront of struggle for civil liberties and for the dignity of those groups that are under pressure, marginalized by the reactionary tendencies that are so prevalent, unfortunately, in Washington. It may seem strange to connect Edward Said with this current debate about academic freedom and the effort to brand pro-Palestinian advocacy and activism as a form of anti-Semitism, because Edward, as much a great Palestinian scholar, not only of issues pertaining to Palestine, but also renowned for his work in literary studies, which were his early and continuing contribution. But what I think just makes this kind of connection very, what shall I say, illuminating, is that Edward, at the same time that he was such a strong proponent of justice and sustainable peace for Palestinians, was also throughout his life, a very determined opponent of anti-Semitism. And what is the further irony and paradox, and why I put this State Department definition of anti-Semitism in the title of my remarks, is that by that definition, Edward himself would be an anti-Semite. So you have a kind of dangerous mind game that that the opponents of the real anti-Semitism become anti-Semites. It takes Washington bureaucrats to achieve that seeming outcome. And there is a silver lining to all of this. And that the silver lining is that this effort to extend the definition of anti-Semitism to perfectly mainstream freedom of expression and activism that no one questioned during the anti-apartheid movement that was associated with South Africa, where there were critics of the movement, especially on the divestment issue, but no one, even on the far right, questioned the legitimacy of that version of the BDS campaign. So you do have to say that it is a consequence of the growing support for Palestinian solidarity. In other words, that's the silver lining. This doesn't come out of a political vacuum. It comes out of the fact that there is a growing recognition that Israel is a rogue state, that it defies international law, that it is responsible for denying fundamental rights to the Palestinian people and sustaining an ordeal of prolonged suffering that is almost unprecedented in modern history. And beyond that, our government, which uses lots of tax money to support this country, this behavior of Israel, is in almost unique solidarity with Israel. It proclaims a so-called special relationship. And the distinctive feature of the special relationship is a protection of Israel against criticism wherever it may arise. The Secretary of State, John Kerry, not long ago, boasted of the fact that hundreds of times in the United Nations, the United States has blocked criticism or censure of Israeli behavior. And what is striking about this is there's no attempt to defend Israeli behavior. It's just a unthinking solidarity that ignores the substance. And in other words, whether the criticism within the UN is justified or not is irrelevant. The only relevant thing is that it's criticism of Israel. And if it's criticism of Israel, it's anti-Semitism. See, that's the sinister aspect of this phenomenon. But as I say, you cannot ignore the fact that this rise in the effort to suppress freedom of expression and threaten academic freedom is directly correlated with the rise of pro-Palestinian activism. And that's the good news, and we shouldn't forget that good news. Because that, the rise of Palestinian activism, again, doesn't occur in a vacuum. It is a response to the increasing perception of Israel as a rogue state when it comes to its international behavior, its acceptance of fundamental legal responsibility, and it's also a recognition of the utter breakdown of the so-called peace process that was supposed to produce a diplomatic settlement of the conflict, and that has been the sort of poster child of U.S. justification for its unconditional support of Israel and the special relationship. And now everyone except those in Washington, even those in Tel Aviv, are now explicit about saying, we will never allow a Palestinian state to come into being. Netanyahu made that very clear in his electoral campaign of last March, and various prominent political figures in Israel have repeated that statement over and over again. So there is no question that the U.S. continued assertion that we must get the parties back to the negotiating table is just a way to allow Israel to have more time to expand the settlements, complete the separation wall, and ethnically cleanse Jerusalem so that they can impose a one-state Israeli solution. See, the very behavior which is violative of the Geneva Convention that allows Israel to do these kinds of things has been shielded from scrutiny by the combination of the American geopolitical muscle and the illusion that the conflict would be resolved by diplomacy. See, if you strip away that illusion, you're left with the understanding, or you should be left with the understanding, that if you want a sustainable peace between Israel and Palestine, the only way you will get it is through civil society activism. Nothing else will achieve that result. And it is for that reason that it is so strategic from Israel's point of view to do whatever it can to preclude this kind of development that is associated with the gathering momentum of the BDS campaign, the fact that it has really, I think, reached a tipping point where major economic projects and major corporations are now breaking their relationships with particularly the settlements and the West Bank extensions of the Israeli presence. So it is this increasing effectiveness of the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement that has to be correlated with this more vicious efforts to create a punitive reaction to the kind of activism and advocacy that is involved in the solidarity movement. The two things are really connected together. And I think another very important issue is the fact that all of the kinds of developments that Azadeh pointed out are only the tip of the iceberg, and that more insidious, in my view, than the people that the Saleda case or the conferences that don't occur are what happens behind the scenes, the covert way of being intimidated by this extension of the notion of anti-Semitism and the fear of being smeared by those allegations. In other words, the conferences not held, the invitations not issued, the people not promoted or hired. That's the so-called chilling effect, which really has, I've been in university life long enough to know that that's where the real impact and the danger of this kind of pressure exists. And this is not new. I took part maybe 12 years ago in a conference in Cyprus, which was trying to talk about the contributions to peace that could be made by an organization called the Interaction Council. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's an interesting organization that consists of ex-heads of state. And I was there as a kind of resource person, and it was chaired by Helmut Schmidt, the former chancellor of Germany. And in that, one of the participants in the conference was the Israeli ambassador to Greece. And he very actively advanced this notion that you could not have criticism of either Zionism or Israel without encroaching on the notion of anti-Semitism, that you were being anti-Semitic if you did those things. And I spoke at the meeting and said, I didn't agree with that Zionism was a political ideology, it was a project, you could either be for or against it as a Jew without in any way questioning your Jewish identity, and that Israel was a state and you needed as a person of conscience to challenge your state when it behaves in violation of international law and international morality. And I had the interesting experience after there was a kind of break, several people, the participants came to me and said, oh, we're so glad that you said this. Only someone who was Jewish could have said this. And after they came to me, the Israeli ambassador came to me very angrily and said, how could you undermine my remark? And of course, this is the interplay that we find around this issue. And what the State Department has done, and I think it in effect has given governmental legitimacy to this point of view that the Israeli ambassador at Cyprus was articulating 12 years ago, making it, in effect, making people regarding people who criticize Zionism or Israel as guilty of the hate crime of anti-Semitism. And what in its report to Congress, what the State Department says, a very interesting document that I also recommend called Contemporary Anti-Semitism, a report provided to the US Congress. And what it says is, we all know that traditional anti-Semitism was something that should be repudiated by all people of goodwill. And that traditional anti-Semitism consisted of hatred of the Jewish people and persecution and discrimination based on that hatred and hostility. But what has emerged, this is again from the report, what has emerged is what they call new anti-Semitism. And I quote from the report, new anti-Semitism characterized by anti-Zionist and anti-Israel criticism that is anti-Semitic in effect, whether or not in intent, and is more subtle and thus frequently escapes condemnation. So it is this new anti-Semitism that would make Edward Said an anti-Semite, and would, if taken to its logical extreme, make what we're saying here from the platform today an exercise in anti-Semitism. See, and that is very perverse. And it's more perverse, in my view, than other kinds of efforts to encroach on free expression, because there's probably no issue facing the American government that more needs free expression and criticism. It's precisely because the government has taken such an unconditionally and, from most points of view, unreasonable pro-Israeli viewpoint, and has so exaggerated Israel's relationship to the U.S. That criticism, essential to the functioning of a democratic society, is especially needed in this context. And this is reinforced, I think, by the degree to which the corporatization of the media has made it rather unwilling to allow reasonable debate. Alan Dershowitz is welcome on mainstream discussions, despite his, extreme Zionist identity. And he's invited to the Obama White House, despite the extremity of his pro-Israeli views. But somebody on the other side will never get access to mainstream media, or to, certainly not to be invited to the White House. In fact, someone as distinguished as Rashid Holiday, the professor at Columbia University that actually holds the Edward Said chair there, he was a friend of Obama in Chicago before Obama entered presidential politics. And Obama quickly distanced himself. He didn't want to be associated with Holiday. But he's glad to be associated with Dershowitz. See, and that's the imbalance that is, even though Holiday is a much more moderate person, and his views are much more inclusive than our Dershowitz's. The political, what I would say, the toxic political atmosphere is such as to make the moderate advocate of an inclusive Israel-Palestine peace much more unwelcome than the extreme Zionist ideologue. And Edward Said's position is very interesting in this respect, because he took, he was passionate, especially after the 1967 war, in his devotion to the Palestinian struggle, the right of Palestinians to resist, the importance of solidarity activity, and at the same time, dispossession of the Jewish people. And he wavered as to what kind of solution would make sense, inclusive solution, which involved both peoples, whether it was one state or two, one secular state, or two kinds of states, or something in between, was not important, not really essential to his worldview. What was essential was an inclusive, sustainable peace that was that it conferred justice on both peoples. And interestingly, I think, and sort of confirming this way of interpreting his impact, is that his fame, international fame, really rested on the publication of Orientalism in 1978. And that was a book that included the concern with the Palestinian issue, but it was much broader and has had as great a global influence as any book published in the last 50 years. And in that book, he goes out of his way to show that the same mentality that produced Orientalism, that is, the domination of the Orient due to a set of coherent beliefs in the superiority of Western civilization, its myths, its values, that in a sense the Orient, or the Arab world, was the inferior other. And he argued, I think very convincingly, that that was the same kind of mentality embedded in anti-Semitism, that you radically distance yourself from the other, and you justify, in the end, the elimination of the other. See, that Orientalism, in the end, is a recipe for genocide, because it is a rationalization for eliminating whatever blocks this superior civilization. We have experienced this within American society in the treatment of indigenous people, Native Americans, to the extent they blocked the American plan of dominating this geographic space. They were candidates for elimination, or at best, marginalization. And Thomas Jefferson, who was probably as enlightened an early American as anyone, and admired the Native American civilization and culture, said, paraphrasing slightly, he said, "We must drive them to the briny deeps to establish our empire of liberty." See, and that's the Orientalist mentality, and that's the kind of resistance to that mentality that this new anti-Semitism tries to delegitimize. See, and that's in my view, why it is so important to understand and resist this effort at mind control. It's really an effort at mind control that is very regressive in its broader implications, insulating the government from legitimate criticism, trying to undermine the morale of the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, and to invalidate its most effective instrument, which currently is the BDS campaign. So one sees that there is this connection, set of connections between redefining anti-Semitism and this special relationship with Israel. And it's my view that unless that special relationship is put in question, it will be very difficult to address these issues. And we have to understand that that special relationship is very harmful to the pursuit of American national interests in the wider Middle East. For instance, the most sensible way of bringing stability and peace to the wider region would be to establish a nuclear-free zone in the whole area, which all of the Arab countries and Iran and Turkey favor. But the US blocks even the mention of that because it would draw into question Israel's nuclear capabilities, nuclear weapons arsenal. In other words, the special relationship prevents us from supporting what would most help stabilize this region that could easily transform itself into a kind of regional major war. What's going on in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere in the region, Iraq, elsewhere in the region, is bad enough, but it could be a good deal worse, and there's no reason to make it work. There's no strategic reason that it should be worse, except for this special relationship. And that needs to be, and it was, in a way, the great breakthrough for the Obama presidency was to override Israel's objections to the nuclear agreement with Iran. It's an agreement that was not, in my view, superfluous, because if you had established a nuclear-free zone in the region, there would be no need for such an elaborate exercise in diplomacy. It was only to circumvent this Israeli problem. But again, it's worth noticing that in order to somehow sustain what all the Western world, in fact all the world, thought was a constructive agreement, the US is now likely to increase military assistance to Israel from $3 billion per year to $5 billion, and to give Israel additional weapons that they had. In other words, to pursue a very reasonable diplomatic initiative that was opposed by Israel, one had to compensate by accentuating their military dominance of the region. See, and that's, again, that's why attention to this special relationship is such an important part of understanding the wider context within which these issues of anti-Semitism arise in such a virulent way. One of the things that Edward Said was very dedicated toward at the end of his life was the responsibility of the intellectual. And particularly he focused on what he called the public intellectual. And he and Edward and Noam Chomsky are probably the most influential examples of public intellectuals that are oriented toward progressive goals. And he contrasted the public intellectual with the academic expert or the professional that gives primary value to the connections that he or she developed with the established order, and therefore at best are neutral on controversial questions. And the public intellectual is the one that dares speak truth to power. That's the distinguishing feature. And as Edward portrayed that kind of role, and if you look around at American universities, there are very few people that are prepared or capable of playing that role. It's a very precious resource for university life, it seems to me, because students learn as much from critical thought as they do in the university library. It is in my view, almost indispensable part of higher education to develop this capacity to think for yourself and to see through the sort of publicly sanctified truth that is disseminated by the media and by politicians and so on. So this role of the responsibility of the intellectual is extremely important to preserve. And it is indirect, of course that's not the direct objective of the definition, this extended definition of anti-Semite, but because of the way in which the Israel-Palestine issue presents itself as the dominant moral challenge, not only here, but worldwide, it encroaches upon the orbit of freedom that a public intellectual possesses. And even someone such as myself, who's not prominent in the way that Said or Chomsky are, confronted the experience that wherever I spoke, while I had this UN position, Zionist groups would organize campaigns to persuade the university to cancel my lecture, even if it wasn't on Israel-Palestine, even if it was on other questions. And they would threaten the university administration with withholding contributions and donations if they didn't comply. And this was true not only in North American universities, but in at the AUB, American University in Beirut, or in Australia, or in Europe, in wherever I spoke. What is true is that none of these campaigns succeeded. They even mounted a campaign in my former university, Princeton, where I was actually giving the Said lecture, and 500 emails were sent to the president of the university threatening with the withholding of contributions. But they didn't. The lecture went ahead without any incident. But what it does is to shift the attention of the audience and the media to this question of whether or not I'm an anti-Semite. And it avoids talking about what I wanted to talk about, which was the current condition of the Palestinian struggle and how Edward Said's thought bore on that struggle. So that it does have this secondary effect, even if it seems to fail. It is a very unfortunate aspect of the kind of conditions that we confront. And I want to close by saying something about the responsibility of the citizen. You know, I mentioned the responsibility of the intellectual, which I think is very important. But the responsibility of the citizen is also important. Our tax-paying money is being used to support these unlawful and immoral policies that have produced this prolonged ordeal for the Palestinian people, and have marginalized the U.S. in many world forums because of this policy. We have an interest as citizens in pursuing a policy that shows respect for international law, respect for international morality. And we can't we can't say Saudi Arabia and Israel don't have to uphold human rights, but Russia and China must. You know, that's what we're doing. We're pursuing this kind of double standards, which undermines the normative importance of human rights and international law for a peaceful world. The Jewish philosopher Abraham Heschel said once, "Few are guilty, but all are responsible." And that's the message that I would hope is taken from a meeting like this. And obviously, we choose our own ways of being responsible. But in my view, one of the best ways is support for the BDS campaign at this time. Thank you very much.
I have a few comments, but I want to skip my comments because it's about the university, and maybe I will just say this, that in my 32 years at this university, I have observed a clear shift in terms of the power of the faculty in running the university. And this is the result of a corporate model of administration being imposed on universities nationally and in our system too. And the problem with that is exactly what we're talking about. The special interest and donors, people of power, have more access and a more convincing power on the administration, when the administration is a managerial layer that sees its role as running the university. So the two issues that are very critical to a university and to academic freedom, sustaining academic freedom, is shared governance and academic freedom. These are the two pillars that sustain a university as a place for open discussion of ideas and debate. And that gets eroded when you have a corporate model of running the university. And some of the experiences that we have had in recent years fall exactly within the issues that Azadeh was talking about. And we have had those experiences, and you remember those incidences that we have had here. But I can get into some of those critical ones that were mentioned and how we experienced it at the university within the question and answer. I want to open it because Azadeh Shahshahani has to leave like about 11:35, so I want to open the forum to questions and comments, and we can all participate in it.
Thank you very much. Just quickly, I had the honor to meet Dr. Edward Said back in 1988 or 89. I went to school at Iowa State University, and he came in. We invited him as General Union of Palestine students, and he spoke about the question of Palestine. And I was honored that he came and had dinner at my apartment with all our friends, and it was just one of the highlights of my life. Amazing gentleman. Anti-Semitism. First, Semitism, I came a little late, I don't know if it was discussed. Who or what is a Semite? That's one. Secondly, I get confused when mostly the media and sometimes academics, and when they compare the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs. I don't know why I don't comprehend that concept. And also, a follow-up on that, if a Jewish person decides to change their faith, does it change their race? So that's where the confusion is. And I'm a Palestinian heritage, Venezuelan heritage as well, but I'm not confused. But when I see Arabs and Jews, knowing that my father grew up and our neighbors were Arab Jews, the Samaritans in Nablus, who are completely anti the creation or the practices of the Zionist state of Israel. And why is it called anti-Semitism, not anti-Zionism?
Well, I would just say your comment is very moving, and it confirms what I was trying to express, that the anti-Semitism has become not a way of opposing ethnic hatred and persecution, but an ideology to discredit critics of Israel. See, that's the trick, in effect, that has been played by those that invoke anti-Semitism. And it's very irresponsible. Of course, the people that are invoking anti-Semitism are themselves ardent defenders of Israel and presumably Judaism. But one should remember, if you take a critical look at Zionist history, that Zionists cooperated in Europe with leading anti-Semitic political figures in the 1930s to promote the expulsion of Jews from Europe. They did not contribute to the genocidal Nazism, but prior to the so-called final solution, which was adopted only quite late in the midst of Second World War, prior to that, after Hitler came to power, and anti-Semitism was very widespread in Eastern Europe during that period, the Zionist movement collaborated, particularly in Poland, with anti-Semitic political leaders who even helped to train the Zionist militias that became the military forces in the War of 1948, where Israel established its independence. So that there was a convergence of interest, because Palestine couldn't grow to the point where the Jewish homeland could be really established as a state without a much more robust immigration. And so there was this convergence of interest between European anti-Semitism and this early phases of the Zionist movement. And that's a history, if you, it's quite a chilling history. It's been very well written about by a Yale historian, Timothy Snyder, in a book called Black Death that was published rather recently, and talks about the whole experience in Europe in the 1930s that preceded the establishment of Israel.
And who is a Semite?
Big pardon?
What is a Semite? Or what is a Semite by definition?
Well, you know, Shlomo Sen, this Israeli historian, has written a whole book saying that the whole idea of what it means to, that the notion of the Jewish people is an invention. I don't know enough to know how to evaluate that kind of argument. In one way, I don't think it's so important in the American context. In the American context, what's important is this ideological perversion of something that should be discouraged and opposed, that is traditional anti-Semitism, and the effort to transform it into something that is very regressive and distasteful, which is an instrument to shield Israel from criticism. That's what's important in my opinion.
Of course, as a linguist, I have to say that Semitic languages include Hebrew, Arabic, Berber, and so it's a whole group of languages. And those are cousin languages.
Yes. So if an Arab is anti-Israel, then he's anti-himself as well. Or her.
I was just wondering, you were talking about the roles and responsibilities of public intellectuals and citizens.
Could you talk a little louder?
So you were touching on the role of public intellectuals. And I was just wondering, in your experience, how much do you feel that we are still being hindered not just by resistance or changing the definition of anti-Semitism, but how much do you feel anti-intellectualism is still hindering that? Do you feel like for future academics that there will be less or bigotry towards academia, or in the future, do you see that as a trend?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get to.
So, in terms of future academics, do you see that there is some sort of, I relate the difficulty in changing the concept we have of anti-Semitism to the resistance we have from anti-intellectuals in America specifically. So I was wondering, do you see that there's a trend of lessening of anti-intellectualism, or do you think that it is just persists?
Anti-what?
Intellectualism.
Oh. I think, I'm not sure how to respond. I think there is this kind of distrust of intellectuals that is quite deep in American society, and a corresponding exaggerated trust of experts who rely on their narrow specialty. And I do think that's why I tried to say that the intellectual in the Said Chomsky sense is a precious resource because it's a kind of endangered species, and that we need to nurture that, just as we try to save the condor, we should also save this endangered species of public intellectual.
Well, I just wanted to say that when it comes to defining it, I think I abhor what my own government does, and I criticize it vocally. That doesn't mean I'm anti-American. And I think if people could distinguish between what a government does and what the people do, you could find peace much more easily. I mean, there is a difference. I'm sure that there are people who abhor what the government Israel is doing. So they should feel safe to speak up. And even in this country, I think you have to be careful when you criticize the government. I hate to say that, but the press is not really defending our rights either. And I'm very disappointed in our press.
I think that is a very important point. And I tried to, that's what I was trying to say about my Cyprus anecdote, that you're being a better American if you're prepared to criticize. That's what responsible citizenship entails. And again, quoting Jefferson, he believed that democracy was only sustainable if the citizenry was vigilant in relation to what the government was doing. And he even said the blood of patriots must be spilled from time to time to uphold the blessings of liberty. So it's a very, and that's why this effort to say criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. It would make kind of criticism of the U.S. policies in Vietnam anti-American, which in fact they were pro-American, because it was a stupid policy and a failed policy. And if the citizens can't criticize stupid policies and failed policies, then the country is in terrible condition.
If I can just add, oftentimes one of the arguments in opposition to the BDS movement or any criticism of Israel is, why are you singling out Israel? Of course, as we all know, all governments around the world, including the U.S. government, commit gross human rights violations, and so, so the pro-Israel groups say, by singling out Israel, you're in fact, being anti-Semitic. Whereas, I think we can confidently say that as American citizens, as Professor Falk pointed out, our government is complicit in the human rights violations happening right now, because obviously our tax money is supporting it. If the U.S. government was to withdraw its military, financial, and diplomatic support from the Israeli government, there's no doubt that the Israeli government would have a very difficult time continuing its human rights violations. And the diplomatic support, obviously, at the UN, and countless times that the U.S. government has vetoed any resolutions at the Security Council in opposition to the settlements or various human rights violations happening. And I should also add that the National Lawyers Guild filed a complaint with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, not only against the government of Israel, but also against the government of the U.S., Barack Obama, to be exact, for lending military support to the Israeli government while the assault on Gaza was ongoing, obviously resulting in the murder of upwards of 2,000 Palestinians, including 500 children.
Well, let's go. We'll go first.
Hey, if both sides, both the Palestinians and the Israelis, disavow a one-state or a two-state solution, the BDS movement is moving forward with some kind of hopes of a solution. Would that solution begin with the Israeli constitution? Would it require a new constitution that would be more inclusive? How would the new peace or the new status quo, how would that look?
Well, obviously that's an important question that really the Palestinians and Israelis have to decide. It's not up to Americans to decide. That was the original error, that the British Foreign Office decided what the future of Palestine would be. So what we have to try to do is to create a political context in which the leadership of both sides sees it in their interest to produce a sustainable and just peace. What shape that takes is not possible to envision at this time. But if we create the conditions, the political will can solve those problems in numerous different ways of power sharing and governance structures. That's the easy part. The hard part is to get to the place where both sides, particularly the Israeli side, is willing to enter serious discussion of how to solve the problem.
Thank you so much for your kind, very lucid presentation. So I've been thinking about this a lot. Recently, are you familiar with the Arun Gandhi's comments about Israel? Arun Gandhi was Gandhi's grandson. His comments,
no, I know he made some.
He made some comments, and he has been disinvited or uninvited from many, many venues where he was going to speak about peace and conflict resolution. And his comments, what he said, describing Israel, a nation that believes in its survival can only be ensured by weapons and bombs. And then he went on to say a few other things. So what do you think about that, to have this very peace-loving person to be, really casted as anti-Semitic, and he backtracked. He really didn't mean all Jews. He meant really Israel. And I think some of the statements were not worded correctly, what Arun said. But what do you think about all this overreaction by many institutions and organizations?
By what?
Many organizations disinvited or uninvited him from many engagements.
Well, I think that is all part of this broader atmosphere of inhibiting free debate on Israel and encroaching upon academic freedom and the freedom of the citizen to hear controversial views. So in my view, whether you agree with what he said or not, he should be allowed and welcomed as a distinguished person and the grandson of an even more distinguished person to express his views. You should give Azadeh the last word.
Sure. Thank you so much. Before I go, I wanted to expand a little bit on the last question in terms of what the future holds, and I very much agree with Professor Falk that it's not us Americans who decide what the shape of the state will be. But I think what is important again, to agree with what you said, is to ensure that there's equality of power between the two sides, because oftentimes there is discussions of, negotiations between the two sides and a conflict. And in my view, this is not really a conflict. And a conflict is where two sides at least come to the table with relatively equal amount of power. We're talking about an oppressive state that is occupying a people. I mean, then how do you expect, the government that is supposedly representing an occupied people coming to the table and negotiating with this oppressor? I mean, what else could Palestinians give? I mean, their land is being taken away, all of their resources is being taken away, they're murdered on a daily basis. It's not really fair for the international community, for Americans to really ask Palestinians to concede even further, whether it's from their land or whatever else. So I think it's just something for us to keep in the back of our minds when you hear on mainstream media that there is this conflict, as if, again, we're talking about two powers with equal amounts of influence that refuse to negotiate with each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and have a safe trip. We still have a little time in this room, about 15 minutes, so John.
I wondered if you could, well, if either of you could talk about the importance of other movements to the solidarity movement with Palestine. And I'm thinking particularly of the Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter, and the importance of those, noting those parallels between different forms of repression, both within the United States and outside the United States, but also the ways in which education or a greater sort of expression of solidarity and advocacy can happen by recognizing and bridging different movements.
No, I think that's a very well articulated common question. I think my impression is that the Palestinian leadership has taken initiatives, as has the African American community, to build now links between and to emphasize the commonality of their struggles. And that's and I'm sure that's very threatening to the Zionist kind of agenda, because when you get, there's a synergy between movements of opposition of this sort that draw on different constituencies in the citizenry, and it's more powerful than just adding the Black Lives Matter to the Palestinian solidarity movement. It has a kind of geometric effect, or a disproportionate effect in augmenting that movement. And I think in historical terms, the solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement is also very important to maintaining the morale of the Palestinian movement, that despite everything that seems to be working against them on the ground, they may in the end win. If you look back at the conflicts since the end of World War II, in almost every case, the weaker side militarily has in the end prevailed politically. See, that's the lesson the Americans should have learned in Vietnam, where they had total military domination. Lyndon Johnson famously said, Vietnam is a fourth-rate Asian power, trying to challenge this great superpower that we are. But if you look at all these conflicts, including the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, and the more recent American experiences in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the battlefield doesn't settle the conflict. And the people that are living under conditions of oppression, they have more patience. They're willing, it's not just a means ends, it's an absolute struggle for them. The Afghans have this proverb or saying, you have the watches, we have the time. And there's a lot of wisdom in that kind of understanding.
Well, one of the major spiritual underpinnings of uncritical American support for Israel has been the influence of Christian Zionism, especially since the Reagan administration. And two questions. Is the influence of Christian Zionism increasing or decreasing over American foreign policy? And what is the role of Christian Zionism, with its spiritual, political, and economic clout especially, been in the attempted academic suppression of the Palestinian freedom movement?
Well, that's a very important question. I'm not sure I can give you very enlightened answers on it. I would say one thing that's interesting is that the Christian Zionist movement has in common with that European anti-Semitism the combination of being very pro-Israeli and very anti-Semitic. Because it too, if you know as you probably know better than I, the Christian Zionist prophecy is that Jesus will only return when all Jews go back to Israel. And therefore, the expulsion of Jews, or making, encouraging Jews to leave America or wherever they are, is organically inherent in their vision of salvation, and so you have this funny combination of things of absolute support for Israel and an underpinning of anti-Semitism toward Jews that are living around them or in the country. My guess is that their influence is fairly stable, not dramatically increasing or decreasing, but they're part of what makes this Zionist pressure on the government as effective as it is, because you wouldn't think it could reshape government policy to the extent that it has, and to really encroach on the most fundamental of American values by adopting this extended definition of anti-Semitism, which is so clearly contradictory to normal understandings of the rights of free expression.
What do you see as the core of that stubborn support for Israel?
The core of the what?
Of the stubborn support for Israel in the American government, because is it just the Zionist ideology, or is there more to it?
Well, again, that's something others may have more insight into than I do, but I think the Southern political mentality is has been very shaped by the military-industrial complex, and that there's great admiration for Israel as the little Prussia in the midst of the Middle East, surrounded by all these hostile countries, and being triumphant in a series of wars. And I don't know, but it's very conjectural that the loss of the Civil War in the South has made the South particularly sensitive to who wins and who loses on the battlefield. And there is a lot of military contracting. The Southern economy is so very linked to the defense sector.
I think there's also, if you look at the history of the development and strengthening power of organizations like AIPAC, which happened over the last 20, 30 years, and they play a direct role in the Congress elections.
Yes.
And so that's another source of influence. Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Falk. I'm kind of interested in what your opinion is as to the settlements. It appears that I don't know how it could be a one-state solution or a two-state solution as long as the settlements are allowed to stay there, being that the settlers are the most ideological and the most violent. And they basically are a citizen army protected by the IDF. So as long as the settlements stay, it's hard to think that the IDF will not also have a presence there.
Yes, that's an important issue, and you express the difficulty that it poses, I think, very well. Some Israeli activists claim that a large portion of the settlers are there for economic reasons, and it's only a small proportion that are so ideologically committed, and therefore they could be subsidized in some way to abandon the settlements. I'm not sure. I'm rather skeptical myself of that possibility. Those people on the Palestinian side that have been urging a one-state solution see that as a secular state in which people wouldn't have to relocate, that the settlements could remain, but it would be a secular state. Whether that's a realistic option, of course it would be fanatically resisted by the settlers themselves. And you know, if you look at the conflict from the perspective of the present, nothing is viable. No solution is viable, as near as one can tell. And so you have to believe in what I call the politics of impossibility to find a path toward solution. But that's happened quite often in our recent history without the experts anticipating it. For instance, the transformation of apartheid in South Africa looked impossible until after it happened. The collapse of the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe didn't seem like it was in the cards historically. Even the Arab Spring was something that came about without any anticipation by those that purported to be the specialists on the Middle East. And the counter-revolution to that Arab Spring was equally unanticipated. So we have to, I think we're not smart enough to be pessimistic. And in that sense, it's responsible to commit yourself to what you believe is right, even though it doesn't seem plausible at the moment.
So to piggyback on what you're saying, I think that whether we're talking about Black Lives Matters, whether we're talking about the Israeli and Palestinians' positions, whatever that might be, I really think it's a historical perspective that we have to take at all times. If we don't do that, then I think we get caught up in the rhetoric and even the political movements of these things. Black Lives Matters, when Minister Farrakhan speaks and brings people together and says it's about Black life and what do we need to do as a group that may be genocide in this country. But yet, taking that out of the context, we see someone that we say is anti this or anti that. So it is finding words that medium and looking at the historical perspective. And as you've just said to us as a group, it really is about really where your passions are and how you see the historical perspective on that. And so, because this gentleman raised a question that Black Lives Matters, that is a conversation that is taking place, and it's trying to look at the overall oppression of the various groups. And some groups will only look at it in a very minute way, others look at it as a generalized way. And then who are the players in that area? Can all players come together because we found a common denominator That's the reason why I raised Minister Farrakhan's name in this conversation, because he does speak to the Black Lives Matters, taking it out of that content. We don't want to hear what he or others similar have to say. So I just wanted to put that little bitter feeling in that.
Well, thank you for that comment. I think it's very important. And as you say, it's really who you're allowed to listen to,
Yes.
that determines what you know and what you don't know. And there is this corporatization of the media is very important because it narrows the spectrum of opinion that is regarded as sufficiently relevant to deserve any kind of hearing. And that narrowing is a very destructive erosion of democratic rights.
If we rewound just a second back to when you said that the military-industrial complex definitely has some skin in the game, and then look at BDS, we think of the BDS movement as being opposed by Zionism. Is there a convergence of greedy Wall Street interests and the Zionist movement in suppressing BDS? Has anybody found any problem with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership? It's been rumored for months that there was going to be serious limitations on our rights to organize sanctions, boycotts, divestment through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Doesn't that mean there could be a larger convergence between global business and Zionism at some level?
It certainly is a speculative possibility. I just don't have the information or knowledge to connect those dots. You know, that you can. It's plausible. It's certainly plausible, and it's certainly there is some evidence that the military sector of the military part of the private sector sees Israel as an important customer and client. See, the two countries that these so-called special relationships with are both very important arms dealers and customers, Israel and Saudi Arabia. And they both have horrible human rights records. And we can't, I mean, Obama is so proud of his relationship with King Salman of Saudi Arabia, even though they've had 100 beheadings in this year, much worse than ISIS. And yet we know all about ISIS, and most of us don't hear at all about Saudi Arabia. And it's not only oil, it's the arms trade that Saudi Arabia supports.
In the same way, we knew and we saw images of the Berlin Wall and talked about the Iron Curtain, and we don't see images of the wall that is, going up and up and up in Israel. And it's a horrendous. When I saw images of the wall finally, thanks to Vida who went there and showed them to me, I thought, why aren't these shown? Why don't we know really? Why don't we see what's happening? One image, like the child on the beach in Greece, it was right, raised so much consciousness about the refugee crisis, and here we don't see it.
No, precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what we don't see that is it's not accidental. It's part of this combination of government and corporations and Zionist influence, AIPAC, and all these things that limit what it is we see and don't see. And there's some very good films on the wall. I can't remember there are two films that really make your point very powerfully. And I can't, one is the name of Palestine. Does anybody know that?
Orange 3 or something.
It's it was actually nominated
Five
for
cameras.
what?
5 cameras.
5 from Emeritus.
No, 5 Cameras is a good film, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. It's
Roadmap to Apartheid.
Which-
Roadmap to Apartheid.
Roadmap to Apartheid.
no.
Omar.
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 Yeah. Omar. Yes. Omar is one. It's very powerful, and the wall is the dominant metaphor in the film. And then there's another film by a French woman who is just about the wall. And you know the wall is the clearest example of Israeli defiance of international law, because there was an advisory opinion in 2004 of the International Court of Justice in which 14 of the 15 judges, you can imagine who the 15th was, decided that the construction of the wall on occupied Palestinian territory was a violation of international law, and that not only should it be dismantled, but Palestinians should be compensated for the harm that they've experienced as a result of the wall. And completely, and the U.S. Repudiated the decision, probably without ever looking at it.
Really quick, I mean, we're at the end, and I keep thinking of this, just had it more as a comment, but I'm going to ask the question of what more can we do? Obviously, those of us who are still here are involved in this in somehow, but it continues to come up that there's the attack on intellectuality, there's the attack on activism, there's an attack on knowledge, and there's the limitation for a purpose on us getting this information, on people seeing what's happening, like the wall and like every violation. How do we go forward to continue to expose to those hardcore Israel supporters who just believe it true?
I mean, you have to have the sufficient dedication to these principles that you swim against the tide, swim against the current. Because if you allow yourself to drift with the current, then you're useless so far as these issues are concerned. So every way you can support this kind of freedom, dialogue, conversation, opening of faculty to diverse views, encouraging student participation, all those things, it seems to me, are worth doing. And as I say, even though the situation looks very difficult, we're not intelligent enough to foreclose positive futures. You have to be, you have to believe that you can know the future to be either optimistic or pessimistic. We're repeatedly surprised by the future. And many of the most important transformations that have occurred during my life were completely unpredicted until after they occurred, and then people like me come and tell you why it's necessary. It couldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I'm kind of the eternal optimist, but looking back at the last 20 years, when we first had, actually less than 20, 2003, when we had the Middle East forums right after. There has been a real shift, I feel, in the public opinion and an opening. I think in 2003 with the Middle East forums, we weren't allowed to talk, and how could we dare? And now there's nobody coming here and shutting us up. And kind of getting back to the question, to the comment that Vida made, I think one strategy, and this is kind of micro level, when these groups, organizations like ANTA and very extreme right-wing groups try to attack, they try to intimidate and they focus on individuals. So if they can intimidate one person, the grandson of Gandhi, they will do that, focus on the individual. When we had hosted Ilan Pape to come here and talk, the focus was on 3 individuals, one on each campus, because this was a tour between 3 campuses that he was speaking, Northridge, San Luis Obispo, and Fresno, and the focus was on one individual in every campus who had organized it. And, well, they weren't successful in that case, because Harry Hellerbrand was the interim president at Northridge, and he got the 3 presidents to write a letter confirming academic freedom and why it's so important. But there is always a strategy to intimidate and silence. And that doesn't work. It hasn't worked. I mean, the BDS movement has really grown, and that makes those groups feel more threatened.
Yes, that's the silver lining. See, the silver lining is that the opposition to these policies of Israel and Zionism has dramatically increased. And you're completely right. For instance, when I was speaking on these issues 5 to 10 years ago, there would always be people in the audience that would try to debate, or either hostilely or in some way genuine. Now they stay away. See, because the positions are so untenable that it only exposes the weakness of the positions. So there is a kind of psychopolitical victory that has been achieved in this period. So your optimism is justified.
Thank you. And maybe we can close with Emeritus. Yes?
I wanted to thank you for coming. As a Jew and a Zionist, I always want to...
Could you talk a little louder?
I'm sorry. I want to thank you for coming. As a Jew and a Zionist, I always want to hear what other people think. I already know what I think, and I don't think I'm very interesting. So I'm very grateful that you made this presentation. As someone who advocates in favor of academic free speech, and I think everyone in here is supporting on that, would you be willing to consider having someone whose views, not on free speech, but on Israel and Palestine, are not in accordance with your own? I would love to hear the dialogue. I'd love to hear you exchange with one another. Would you be willing to consider that? Is it something you've done? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, to have a debate and dialogue, that would be perfectly wonderful.
Yes, of course. I mean, the difficulty is that it's very hard to find people that are prepared to debate in a serious way. I mean, I wouldn't, I've been asked to debate Dershowitz, for instance, several times, and I wouldn't do it because he just sort of screams at you and calls you names and denounces. You know, so there's no, it's very dissatisfying. But I think serious conversation and discussion of how one finds common ground and works toward a just and sustainable peace is absolutely necessary and will take place when the political climate changes a bit. But thank you for your comment.
I want to call on Mary Hussein because she has something to share with us.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of Fresno Filmworks, I'd like to invite you to come to the festival next November 14th through the 16th. And we have films from 21 different countries, but we have 3 from the Middle East. On the opening night, we have a French-Turkish film, and then on the Saturday, we have a collaborative film between an Armenian and a Turkish man. But I want to specifically for this audience invite you to give a unique opportunity to watch a film about nonviolent resistance in Palestine. Saturday at 7:30. The name of the film is A Wanted 18, and the director will be joining, one of the co-directors will be joining us from Canada. So I would really like a productive conversation in my role as moderator. I would really appreciate some thoughtful, intelligent conversation. So please spread the word and come out, in particular, to see The One at 18. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for your presence, for your comments, for the questions. Thank you, Dr. Falk.